Hello everyone, today we talk about Crusade infantry for our historical military unit series, thus concentrating on the Frankish infantrymen of the Ultramar states between the 11th and the 13th century, right? I already made videos about crusading warfare in general, and we have really to make a lot of work still on it. However, looking at this type of troop is important because naturally it reveals a big deal about the infantry was not really the size of army at this point, but cavalry could not operate without it. So in any case, for medieval warfare, whenever you look at infantry, look at cavalry, and vice versa. But there are also other questions of historiographical interpretation that really get down very often to just the personal expertise and or impression of the single scholar, really, given first of all the general scarcity of information for these times and places in general, but also for the lack really of a historiographical or methodological interest in the first place for the topic, even of course, that can really say make a list of all the contingents that we know about at this point in this context. I made a video recently was about the troops at least available on parchment / paper by the Kingdom of Jerusalem. At some point was the list, the Babylon list, right? That is somehow detailed, right? And that was quite useful, but it also wouldn't tell you the whole picture because, say, for my research back in the day, I wrote a first chapter of 200 pages about exactly the. I think I listed thousands of listed of all the contingents of a given regional context in more or less the end of the 13th, so we are even close, and the beginning of the 14th century. And I observed that the few studies that had just tried to cover like what was the at least prescriptively, right, the amount of troops to field in a given context naturally didn't match at all the picture, because what was eventually fielded, right, compared to what was preemptively just kept like saying these are the troops that we have to mobilize in theory in a given moment, does not in fact take in consideration the latter source especially doesn't take in consideration the type of add-ons, let's say, that would normally be present for whichever reason. Most medieval armies fundamentally had this core professional troops that, especially in this centuries, become ever more mercenary in nature, which means that you basically could hire them ad hoc, and thus were not counted in the general structure. There's no such thing, like throughout the entire Middle Ages, telling us exactly what, like, the description of an army, right? It's a soldier by soldier, like saying a list of all the people. There's just one source, which is the Book of Montaperti from essentially the Florentine Commune in the mid-13th century, that is mostly like still an appeal, right, of a list of troops that, at least a part of them, that were in the army, and it tells us really a lot, but even in that case, doesn't tell everything, right, doesn't give us a clear picture operationally of what this army technically was, right? So just bear in mind that for the Middle Ages there is no such source in the first place. Why is this important? Because, well, naturally we would all like to have precise kind of numbers, which is perhaps maybe an obsession. Just generally speaking, scholarship is a bit too skepticistic about the numbers provided by chronicles, which tend actually to be somehow accurate, right? They don't really, if you really study the sources, the campaigns, generally speaking, the background from which the sources came from, you realize that they were much more reliable than what, especially a certain type of of historiography in the West has tried to say, like, if it's not, this is a bit like the materialistic issue, like if there's not a precise laboratory proof that you can count and be completely like 100% sure about, you can't say anything about that. So if somebody says there were lots of people, there is, say, 6,000, but if I don't see those 6,000, I can't say, the source is worthless, right? This is a very dumb way to proceed, and naturally the most refined and quite rare, in fact, quite rarely so, military historiography is tending to reevaluate dramatically narrative sources, not just because it's basically all we have concretely, but because it also offers a wide amount of info that it's just rather the scholars that are too lazy to read, to literally draw all the information from and trying to make some kind of stats, right? And the more you do that, especially, that's my personal experience, like from different sources that also have not much to do with each other, you realize that when you read them overall, when you read them all together in a chronotaxis, they're actually pretty damn reliable, and they never say something hallucinatingly distant from that. I naturally studied a very kind of advanced area. We've seen already, for example, this depends on the culture as well. Speaking of Crusades, the Islamic historiography is not so clear, right? The Islamic historiography, just for certain specific theological, cultural, literary reasons, just tends expressly, and you shouldn't even complain about that, because it was just the way they wrote it and they knew it. They didn't write for the purpose that you would have liked them to write, saying, the enemies were, 100,000, right? This enormous circle. Now, also the Westerners did it sometimes, especially with the most faraway places. But especially when you study in comparison to, say, Frankish sources and the Muslim ones at the Crusades, you realize that Western historiography was really much more analytical and kind of, modern in that, and reliable in that sense, because we cared more, right? In many ways, we are the children of the Greeks, so we tend to want to analyze things, but it goes beyond just numbers or data or per se. It's also how you criticize what these numbers actually mean. And considering also for whom this stuff was written. But I don't want to digress that much, because you say, what does this have to do with Frankish infantry? Well, I noticed, right, just browsing the books I have, and generally speaking, looking at what is supposed to be, if not the most reliable studies, at least the ones that have some sort of reputation by name and so on, that the general approximations done on just the composition, for example, the arms ratio, right, talking about cavalry, infantry, missile, say in general, given missile in Western sources, mostly foot missile, is quite like, first of all, not really particularly examined topics. I'm sure that there is something more updated out there, and I'll be looking into it, because today we're not really talking about this whole thing in the first place. But generally speaking, they tend to go by something that says, a historian wrote, because at the end of the day, especially disclosure books, or even some of our very precise ones, date back to things like, Verbruggen, or even Delbrück, or whatever. They once said something was maybe just, repeated by others and considered as fair by a degree, and then they simply go by that, and they never question whether it's right or not. Naturally, in most of these cases, it is for real a matter of speculation, right? It's not entirely clear. We simply don't know, right? We don't have the sources. We will arguably never have them, because there is still a lot of archives to look at, but say it's unlikely that at this point, right, we would just find some relic here and there, right? There's not a hidden mystery that we hadn't still sorted out from the Middle Ages. Mostly how we read it, which is the most interesting, and the thing that really can change things a lot, including, again, throwing in this kind of commonplaces sometimes, and generally speaking, the idea that this was such a poor world that for some reason, and especially there is a bit of a feudal bias, right? The idea that feudal armies were somehow just about the knights, right? And or that the fact that obviously historiography concentrated on the knights obscures the other types of troopers, right? We've seen this also in, I don't know, classical Hellenic warfare, that everything is about the hoplites, but here and there you find a javelin or then a slinger, then a horseman. You say, well, but these have always been around. It just the scholar, the historian, just doesn't focus on that. But they were there, and we don't have much better info about that. So we can't simply go by things where or another. Naturally, there is something called military logic, which is somehow difficult to apply, but it also comparatively and diachronically can answer both questions. So there are a number of points to touch regarding these Frankish infantrymen of the Outremer states, whether was fighting there, coming from Europe and or being even led locally, either from of European descent or even from the locals. I made a video about the Turcopoles. We've seen how things could be, how interchangeable they could really be, how many Westerners fought for the Seljuks, for example, as mercenaries, how many Muslims there were in the same Crusade army. So everything is, let's say, the armies of the Outremer states are fascinating because they're more distant from Europe, so they're a bit less under the lights. We can't see them a bit less of what was happening there. But probably there was something more, say, more interesting from a tactical point of view than what we normally see. In any case, I made a video about pilgrims, or at least, they came together with other types of troops, a bit like this kind of followers of the crusading forces, that in this case could be really poorly equipped, right? Probably equipped, some with clubs, right? Or with nothing more than spear or a bow, right? Well, already these weapons can do something, just per se, for talking of infantry, and you have spear, bows especially, you can already, in substantial numbers, even if these troops were evidently not trained, at least initially, they were just people just joined the armies, etc. They could make mass volume of fire, which was naturally very important to counter the Seljuk horse archery, which in part was recruited in the same exactical way. Religious fanatics, people coming from, I don't know, Central Asia, just as soon as they heard that one emir from Syria or the Jazeera was mobilizing, they would just flock there, without training, knowing they would have not even be paid, but just to loot, and simply doing that, like paying the way to the main army. That's an interesting topic. I will perhaps make other videos about this, especially as far as the pilgrims in the Christian armies were concerned. There were, however, nothing, even at the level of proper militia, that you could find in, normally in the various polities at the time. Right? These were just desperates of some sort that fundamentally helped attritioning the enemy army, while naturally the strong elements now, as we'll see, were else, right? But again, there is this bias about the fact that feudal retainers, all armored mercenaries in particular, would be essentially making up the largest amount of foot soldiers in most crusading armies, right? So, I must say that as far as I studied crusade battles, and generally speaking the cavalry infantry ratios, it is true that especially in the earlier period, say the very late 11th and say the first half of the 12th century, the Crusade armies would be not particularly, infantry, rich in infantry, right? There was a sort of quality compactness that derived likely from the difficulties probably that all the Crusader states had in terms of properly manpower, right? The fact that especially Westerners as such were not particularly committed to the outre-mer effort, because naturally it was distant, there were issues at home, and that of course there was not like a dramatic integration, at least initially, between the Frankish element and the one of the Near East. It's a bit of a cliche, right? I'm not entirely convinced that this was the case. It was just a bunch of feudal lords that just treated the locals like garbage, and thus this would spark like some sort of political failure. I don't think that's the case. In particular, actually, I think that these states, until the Battle of Beha-ed-Din, had a dramatic potential that mostly lay in the of course, kind of the located the polities laying around, how it was protected by the desert and the sea from one side. The fact that the Westerners controlled the sea routes, nobody could really oust them, because there were no other powers like the one of the maritime republics in the not just in the Islamic world, basically also in the rest of Europe. And of course, there must be a political and social explanation that I saw mostly in the just in the organization of crusading states. In fact, they were mostly competing with each other. They wouldn't have a greater sense themselves of the broader cause as far as their personal houses were concerned. This is also debatable. Surely it's a mix of factors, but the long story short is that in spite of the fact that the Levant did have an important urbanization, and as we have seen also important infantry forces from the Ibelin list, the number of infantry was not particularly large, right? You don't find a full kind of sense of local militia organization like there is, especially in some areas of southern Europe, southwestern Europe, and that would simply take the field as a unitary, compact, in fact, state-like force. Right here, you have rather still in this century is indeed still, first of all, a mild contrast between the knights and the commoners in the first place within the same armies, right? So a sort of competition, especially until the mid 12th century. The idea that cavalry was not really entirely decisive. As such, was the superior arm, but it had not really swept the battlefield from most, from all infantry, right? So that this would not pose a threat in general. That wouldn't stand a chance to defeat cavalry in open field without the support of other cavalry. So generally speaking, it does seem from one side that mercenaries that increase over time, over the period, and feudal retainers, and or say also feudal retainers change in nature over time, would make up the majority of the infantry. But at the same time, it seems somehow just unlikely that mercenaries or retainers alone would be just enough, right, as infantry forces per se. Surely there was an integration of local militias as well. There were some there was some proper settlement of Westerners also in the outre-mer states that were called, right, to perform this function. Mostly was, again, about knights. And, of course, within the feudal retinues, we can insert lots of people, especially when you consider money thieves. We've seen how none of these thieves were, revolving around castles. Some were around cities, right? There were, for example, the Italian infantries, famously enough, that, as we've seen in the videos about, the Siege of Acre, now we will see it also in the Battle of Arsuf, were actually responding to their local consuls, not really to the feudal institutions of the land, that, of course, were kind of settled by in the first place, and thus respecting themselves in turn. So the impression is that there was also lots of other troops next to these, because you could consider even the Italians as mercenaries by a degree. But even that is not entirely correct. There was even a lot of considerable initiative by some of these groups alone, sometimes in the hinterland, which is somehow underevaluated. We've seen it, for example, in the prodromes to the siege of Acre, where basically even the same local vassals and other elements, again, even the Italian merchants had their own forces that went wild in the hinterland. At that point, was objectively like a deteriorated situation because Jerusalem had fallen. So basically, the Mamluks were just like the hinterland was a bit of a frontier area, sort of far east in this case, where really there were areas that were no man's land, and or at least that could not be just directly settled, or even when they were mostly like avamposts, so there was a lot of guerrilla going on. Right, so especially for the later period of the Crusade, surely there was some greater integration of properly local, if you want, even communal forces, right? Especially from the cities, of course, that again were more prominent, as we've seen, even just in the composition of the, say, in providing, in fact, urban forces compared to where most of these crusaders came from, France, right? So you see, indeed, considering the highest standards of French feudalism, that of course the Levant is different. It's less feudal, right? It is tendentially more centralized. Again, there are ups and downs. Things change over time. We will see it perhaps in some non-strictly military video. But again, those forces surely figured in a substantial way. The same Turcopoles, after all, were locals in a way or another. It wasn't even about them being Turks or whatever, just they fought that way. They were readily available, and they would mostly fight admittedly as horse archers, but not only, right? We're not forgetting about one element, of course, is that knights dismounted on many occasions, and this surely added to the numbers of infantry further. We will talk this perhaps better in another video, but there are people who go as far as saying that the infantry development in Europe during the same time had much to do with what was happening during, say, in the Near East, right, with the solutions especially taken by knights that had their horses shot down by Turkic arrows, and thus they had to fanatically defend, standing their ground, encountering not just cavalry, but also, as we've seen before, the missile fire of the enemy. I've been somehow skeptical about this as well, because while it is true that the Islamic world of the late Golden Age was somehow advanced, of course, also by standards like, I don't know, the Chinese one. Most trebuchet crews came from the Middle East, even in Imperial China. We know that the Arabs developed, they had their own infantries, they had their own, also the spread of the crossbow, other technicality, let's say, that the Westerners surely observed and motivated, but not because, again, these things would not exist, right? Crossbow was there in Europe around ever, as we'll see now. Also, the padded coats were there since, really, from a long time in Europe, and they seem to have been just revived substantially during the crusading era, rather than and for reasons that may have been strictly technical and not really based on, in fact, cultural influence, right? There's this idea that, I don't know, one people must have learned something from just another. This is true if you if you understand how globalized the world already was at that time. So you can't quite say something was invented, I don't know, from the other side of Eurasia, and from the other side they wouldn't know, right? But first of all, things can already be around, especially during the Middle Ages. Again, the crossbow is not really a novelty, right? It existed since the ancient world. I made multiple videos about this, and they survived throughout all the early Middle Ages in Europe. The Normans during the Crusades were also famously described with this very powerful bows that, for example, the Byzantines didn't quite have in the same amount in power, apparently, but that, of course, were known also there. So nothing brings me to think that even certain types of shields or certain type of tactics, especially the one of infantry, the combination of pikemen and crossbowmen and specific shields here have to do with necessarily a mutation from the Near East. In my opinion, we are heavily underestimating high medieval European warfare, and especially the level of development already of certain infantries, especially in Southern Europe, that from quite a while were or had always been significantly advanced, and that just we haven't quite covered for just because it's difficult to cover anything at the time in detail in the first place. I mean, even the Islamic world is, as we were saying before, rather foggy overall. We especially when we want to look at this more, in fact, especially the era of Egypt, like of Levant, strictly speaking, meaning that the areas that were more urbanized, more sanitary, less feudal, that were more similar even to the West in the way of war. That the Egyptians had a kind of more similar armies to the one of the Crusaders than the one of the Seljuks, right? Because that's a completely different culture. It's more. It's actually similar to part of what you see in Western armies as well, as far as the feudal, chivalric dimension and the question, zootechnical capacities of Central Asia, and even Persia, of course, from which these people came, naturally were concerned. But I'm not sure that there is more than just some kind of guess about these relations, right? It's not because you see something in the West, for example, archaeologically speaking, it looks like something that was used in the Levant. It means just it must have been borrowed from there. It just evolved because of contact with the East. Because in the East, they may have even used it before. But if a weapon or a type of armor or whatever appears later, doesn't mean that it appeared there for a simple reason of imitation. It must have been functional for some purpose that at that point they developed on the base of the existing designs or whatever, right? And actually after the Crusades, or during the same Crusade, it was a great deal of Western influence. Even as far as the Middle East. We've seen it in that video recently about Western Iran and Islamic Caucasus. We see again those, for example, Italian crossbowmen used as far as the Indian Ocean as mercenaries by the Ilkhanate, right? You find at that point, especially the Mongols had just emerged, and I made that other video about what the Westerners thought basically of the Mongols at the time. And we have seen how by the 13th century, say the mid 13th century, nobody was really impressed with Mongols' equipment, especially, which seems to emerge like from the Western sources, especially when the Mongols arrived at the gates of the Holy Roman Empire, and it turns out that these same powers needed substantial amount of Western mercenaries later on. Plus, naturally, I'm not saying that they weren't advanced militaries. They were, and that's the fact that they would use Western troops from so far away actually proves it ipso facto. But that's exactly the point that I'm practically making about this all. In any case, when we look at the early Crusade armies, we definitely see that for Hasmonean Knights there was this kind of pretty sturdy, courageous, heavy bulk of troops. Yes, most of them were mercenaries and or feudal retainers. Feudal retainers, especially, I don't know, the time of First Crusade, weren't particularly heavy, telling the truth. They were mostly in the form of squires, light cavalry. Occasionally, like, they could fight in any way, also on foot. And as we've seen, generally speaking, the certain tactical situation, mostly the numerical inferiority of the Westerners that were heavier on average than their opponents, would bring them to dismount and to just to defend, right? To exploit the advantage that defense has and that infantry exploits definitely better than cavalry, because cavalry, by definition, cannot defend in any way unless it's dismounted, so it becomes infantry. And these troops were, let's say, the mercenary elements would increase later, right? So it's only by the 13th century that you see squires becoming practically indistinguishable from their own masters, and technically they're not even squires anymore. They're just mostly, again, at that time, these services being heavily monetized, they're more like mercenaries. But in that case, they would mostly operate as still some sort of heavy cavalry by some degree. And naturally, by dismounting, they would be heavies in their own regard, right? However, in a typical 12th century context, like you would imagine, crusading infantry consisting surely of spearmen, right, and bowmen, crossbowmen, that of course could use these weapons interchangeably. I mean, it would have not been rare to see a spearman equipped with a bow at the same time. This is especially important if you consider the advantage that naturally infantry has, for example, on horse archers that cannot quite act simply as lancers. They do have shock capacity, but tendentially they do not come to grip with the enemy until the very end of the battle, if anything, and also by that point they're usually exhausted. So they're literally light cavalry. Instead, this infantry is heavier by comparison, so at the time you're facing a charge of fake one sometimes just to compact the ranks so that the archers with the heavies and so that the archers can shoot in the midst, kind of with higher chance of hitting. You would pass to the spear. But as soon as this threat passed, you would actually counter the enemy also with bow. Naturally, this would mostly be done with a, let's say, a functionalized kind of a quite orderly and combined arm tactics. You would probably separate, specialize tactically the heavy infantry from the archers. This was the case pretty much everywhere, including among Muslims and in Europe. So ideally you would have this line, this first ranks holding against what was mostly light cavalry of the enemy till the end of the battle, where the heavies could really try their shock tactics on a worn out heavy infantry. And in the rear, archers, bowmen at least. And we don't know really, also for as far as Europe is concerned, and a big deal of the interaction of this infantry. Consider that by the 13th century, even the major battles fought in Europe, such as Tagliacozzo, Benevent, Markfeld, etc. So they are the largest feudal battles fought in Europe. So we know that there was lots of infantry there. When they are described by the chronicles, were mostly from a feudal background, infantry basically is not even named. That is to say, we can't even properly reconstruct, given that those are the only sources, what infantry was actually doing, right? There are some historians, including myself, that are writing, at least because I documented the place where this was happening the most, but also others in this context saying that essentially the most likely tactic involved there was, probably from much older time than we think, cavalry in the center, infantry on the wings, and so essentially these various battle lines in depth is just for the largest armies. These are not to be found at the time of the Crusades really anymore, because after Jerusalem, really, like, first of all, the crusading armies had never been particularly large. in the first place, both for the times initially and after that because of that massive territorial loss, but during the time also, generally speaking, as we have seen, because of the shortage of manpower locally. This, especially this wing tactics, is mostly documented for 13th century history. You could have not seen it applied again in the Near East because too few troops, right? However, this doesn't mean that in the smaller engagements that normally are not recorded in detail, you cannot reconstruct them because the chronicles just mention them but do not even spend themselves to describe what kind of tactic was enacted there. You do suspect that that was mostly the practice. For example, at the Battle of Arsuf, we do know that there were the Crusader knights and then the peasant crossbowmen and other infantry that fenced off the Ayyubid attack successfully, right? Also proving, by the way, as we've seen, as far as the knights were concerned, as far as the even missile power was concerned, that Westerners were superior to the Muslim armies on average. There is hardly a doubt, right? I thought everything was much more balanced. But when you study the actual sources, you do realize that this kind of inferiority does not really exist. Battles were mostly won or lost because of reasons of general leadership, cohesion, how the battle lines could connect each other, whether the enemy tricked you, caught you by surprise, things like these. Not much about the quality of that all. So the impression, again, is that generally speaking, Crusade infantry tactics were substantially advanced because mostly also Western infantry tactics in Europe were that advanced. And so there was likely much more actually that Europeans were bringing on the table in the Near East, as opposed to the Near East influencing, allegedly, European tactics at home. This is the idea that I got pretty substantially, and so far I've seen nothing really to come to debunk it, and I don't think there is. Because even when we want to stress the fact that, say, especially Arabs, as we've seen, were more sedentaries, they had cities, whatever, but we do not really have... I don't think there is really the evidence, even if they had existed as such, of properly this pretty strong infantries that made the grade, right? You don't find at least news in military history in Egypt or Syria of infantries like, I don't know, the Lombard ones or the Flemish ones, what they were doing in Europe during the 12th and the 13th century. You mostly just have, by that point, of course, the Arab world feudalized because of the Turks, because of the collapse, basically, of the caliphate. So there is all that arrived at last under the Mongols, but that sense of Arab world as a bit of a continuation of a centralized, statal, bureaucratic system with a permanent military base in cities, etc., like it had been the Roman Byzantine model, was being eroded. Right, exactly in the moment in which it was instead the Westerners that on the base of very often of post-Roman Europe and the cities, etc., were redeveloping infantries in a consistent way. Right, so we really have to make lots of videos more about Islamic warfare to really get what infantries were really about. We're talking about the Dailamis recently in that video again about Western Iran, the Caspian area, and so on. We've seen that even some bunch of savages, fundamentally, from the Caspian, the mountains next to the Caspian Sea, were more effective and prized sometimes than the ones from some of the most advanced places in Mesopotamia or in Egypt, right? So it's somehow, again, not to say that those areas didn't have good militias of some sort, but also the political events, and looking who took over the Jazeera especially, really doesn't leave much room for saying, okay, that there was such a strong military that was able to eventually counter. If anything, if there had been something consistent in previous centuries, now it was in crisis, right? And the picture is much less kind of positive. And so this makes you see in perspective properly European infantry is as much more self-made than, again, this sort of obsession of I don't even know how to call it, the sort of mechanistic causality connection between, I don't know, the invention of a weapon or not, the passage. Everything is very complex. Of course, if you look at Spain, that mostly, there weren't so many Spanish crusaders in the east. If anything, there were mostly in the 13th century when also Spain had more feudalized, properly westernized, but we do see that the Islamic influence had brought in Spain sometimes even more advanced weaponry than the one existed in France and Italy at the time, especially in the early days, 11th, 12th century. Then everything kind of Francicizes in a way also in Spain, so things change also materially, whenever there is a collapse there, also Islam, as you know. But it's important to measure the pulse of this strength, because otherwise nothing is really clear. And just speaking, for example, about the power of missile fire the Westerners had, right? Speaking about crossbows, for example, we know they were around as early as the First Crusade. The Normans from France, from Sicily, etc., they simply, like, they were mostly fighting also against the Byzantines. And as you know, I mean, especially the latter, the Oathville, they also found the Principality of Antioch, and that in fact Anna Komnena falls in love with, because that's really what happened, and are described by her, in fact that's why I name her, of course, as not just essentially the bravest horseman, etc., but so the shock charge of Western Frankish tactics and so on were being spread now victoriously, right, all over the West as a model, right, of universal authority. But also these very powerful crossbows that were definitely very impressive for the same Byzantines, that were said to be able to transpass so many, layers of protection and so on, because they made these games, these experiments, these competitions and so on with actual testing and stuff. Except differently from our own today, they're actually all pretty lame, right? They were using the same weapons to kill people on a regular basis at the time, so that's really the context that you should need in order to try to test any sort of replica in the first place. However, it's fair that by, say, especially the middle to late 12th century, the crossbow was really kicking in fully in among the Frankish infantrymen. Some say, again, it was prevalent. This was the weapon that was mostly used by the Franks at that point in Outremer. Not really. Again, this is a bit of another cliche. Heavy infantry was always the thing. There is no evidence that there were at least more crossbowmen than say, spearmen. Right, even though, as we've seen, there could be a bit of a hybrid there, but generally speaking, that also is not really a good indicator particular development of combined arms, right? It's a bit like the cataphract of the early days. You can have the hero that acts individualistically, can be a sort of shock cavalryman as a horse archer at the same time, but eventually, the more advanced the military culture and the more the two roles tend to split. Crossbows, generally speaking, also in Europe, do not surpass particularly large amount, right? They become prevalent basically all over Europe, right? All Europe had all the time longbows, for example, but crossbows take over, and that's also something you have really at least to keep in mind when people talk about, I don't know, but it's the fire rate of the bows, but BS, right? There is much more than that. And I will not digress again on the 100 Years' War. Just know that the English won because they were pretty darn good, right? Not because they had the longbow, right? That's the point. In open field. The point I was making, though, and what is beautiful is reading the sources, reconstructing battles. Again, I brag mostly about my Battle of Poitiers video that I made last autumn, because that's really eye-opening on the fact that even major victories that are normally about the longbow thing. At least, yes, we have resized it, but never to the extent of the sources, so the people who were actually there, or at least that knew that world, really did. Right? This is the point that seems to be stressed over and over, especially in the Anglospheres, that has brought missile power to too high levels. Right? The fact that missile troops are light infantry, that is by definition something that cannot compete with the heavies, infantry or cavalry alike, which doesn't mean that just staying away they can defeat cavalry alone or infantry alone. It doesn't work like that, right? They work all in combined arms, and they're definitely the weakest one of all in the game. They're not even meant to be decisive. They never were. The same goes for the Muslims, right? The fact that they had tons of horse archers and just a tiny ultra-elite heavy cavalry doesn't mean that the horse archers alone were anything decisive. They never won a battle alone, right? Because light forces cannot do that by definition. That's why we call them light. That's the actual distinction. It's not a matter of weight or level of armoredness. It's literally whether they can hold their ground or not, right? And in fact, also having such large armies that fight with faint flights, hit and run tactics, it's just by itself. The same can be said for the Mongols, actually. Just a declaration of inferiority, unless eventually you actually manage to win more often than not. That's the case of the Mongols, but it's not the case of the Seljuks, for example, against Westerners. And still recognizing that these Westerners put you in the necessity of carrying out the tactic. The tactic is not a standard model. If you have the upper hand, you actually go attack the enemy yourself without all these ballet. This is an elementary strategic principle. Right? If you have the force to smash, you use it. And if you have the force to smash it because you're superior to the enemy. And that's why you can do it. If you need to make feint flights, complex maneuvers, whatever, it means that in that moment, if you manage to carry them out successfully, well, but in that moment you do not have at least anything heavy in the center that can withstand the smashing power of the person that is in front of you. Right, so that's why you have to recur to something more complex. Naturally, here I'm not going to descend also on how consider that all these military systems develop not much against one another, but within their own culture themselves. So it's obvious that, the Mongols had never quite met something like Western cavalry when they met it. Right, they had mostly been fighting against other Mongols, the Chinese, that also had good cavalry and so on, so I'm not diminishing that, but that were still somehow different. And we have this strange idea in the West, which sounds pretty self-sabotaging, and for some reason we were rough or primitive or underdeveloped until especially the Crusades came around and we opened to the world. But from a strictly military point of view, that's what I've been analyzing for more than a decade continuously now. I haven't found any evidence of this. I haven't found any kind of civilizational impairment, and I think the Crusades by themselves speak volumes, because tactically wise they are. Of course, it was a decentralized era, so the Westerners didn't commit themselves too much politically or strategically, so it's already a miracle that they conquered Jerusalem, the first expedition. But even the fact it happened technically is remarkable to a point we should reevaluate really the quality of these forces. That I'm really a great advocate of that and made multiple videos explaining this fact. In any case, again, crossbows are mostly, you can go as far as say, maybe not elite forces, but at least the ones that really matter on the field, because you need also a certain level of collective training, whatever, really are. Right? Again, in Western armies, you check in the 12th, 13th century, look at the number of crossbowmen. It's never particularly high, right? It's a big deal if it's already more than 1/10 of the total of the forces, right? Because they needed few but good, and this is something that goes on throughout the Middle Ages, even in later times. So while again it is true that in the early Crusades, in the early period of the Crusades, you say you see something more interchangeable. See even knights using crossbows on more frequently, whatever. First of all, the crossbows were less powerful, so they could even be more spread, right? Because they were also cheaper, technically speaking. It's not that they weren't effective; they were different types, different kinds. Because a crossbow then can simply evolve into a catapult, for example, just like the musket was born as mobile artillery, became a handgun later, right? So you always have this back and forth. This is typical of the Middle Ages, of pre-standardization of arms in the late modern age. However, it's crucial because it's not just, again, the technology in itself. It's not the fact that we're crossbows, but we have to understand what crossbows really were. And the more crossbows become advanced, naturally, the more elite also the troops that employ them really are. Again, if you look at the aforementioned Italian mercenaries, the Genoese, the Pisans, the Venetians, they use themselves pretty contained numbers of crossbow. They are pretty darn good. There is no doubt about that. But again, they're meant to be used in little doses, also because they cost. They invest, this polities invested in their training and all. Today I will not digress why, generally speaking, the Italians pioneered most of that type of warfare, also how much this interferes with, say, involves the maritime warfare dimension. It's not all, but it's something of it. Just say that this type of quality was there. We've seen it in video about Acre, that even the Templars, the Arabs, recognized that, say, that even some common Italian troops, right, not mercenaries or just volunteers from pretty shady areas in the Apennine, were somehow pretty resilient, that they fled after basically everybody else. So in that defeat, so it's very difficult to calibrate even just what kind of trooper we're talking about. You can't talk just about one type of crossbow, one type of pikeman, one type of knight, right? Now, there are interesting descriptions dating to the 12th century. For example, Beha-ed-Din, writing of Crusade infantry at the Battle of Arsuf in 1191. You know, it's one of the most famous battles of the Crusades during the third one under Richard of England. Describes how the Franks, in fact, were the Frankish infantry specifically, were, quote, clothed in a kind of thick felt and mail corselets as ample as they were strong, which protected them against arrows. I have seen men with up to 10 arrows stuck in their bodies marching no less easily for that. So this info is interesting because it shows, first of all, that by this point, we're at the end of the 12th century, this infantry looks pretty well armored, right? It's still it's at least heavier from what a normal Muslim infantry troop would be, right? They have this wide mail corselets. They're infantry again, so legitimately they are mostly heavies, right? Given that they are targeted, in fact, by arrows, and this is where the Pourpoint, again, story goes on, right? These guys that have multiple, as we'll see now for Ambroise, arrows stuck in their armor, and they simply go on as if nothing happened, right? We have calculated the potential of armies of, let's say, 30,000, mostly horse archers from the Islamic side. If you count how many arrows they brought with them, there are numbers go easily up to, several 100,000 arrows, to even millions sometimes with reserves, etc. It's a huge, unspeakable logistical effort, but they did use it. We have seen it in Mongol logistics, right, with just a few decades away from the meeting with the Westerners, let's say. So the idea is that we've seen it in the video about the Battle of Hattin, for most of your time as a Crusader infantryman, you would just have to be under the Muslim arrow fire, right, which is pretty unnerving and very effective psychologically, but not very effective materially, right? Most of these arrows were, of course, but let's say lots of these arrows were not even just to wound significantly anyone, right? And armor, of course, was designed to basically neutralize the effect of these darts, just as, generally speaking, it was against even more powerful blows of swords, axes, etc. at short range, right? Because that's the deal with armor that we tend to underestimate. That at this point, technology was such, right? The potential jowl that could be delivered to this weapon was contained enough for armor, after all, and offensive weapons to just counterbalance each other, right? That's the entire point of it all, right? It's a complex system. It involves the shield, these other layers of protection we will see now, so it's never as simple as it gets. And of course, arrows could penetrate mail. We've seen it also with the crossbows that were used also by the Muslims, by the way. So everything depends on the piece, on the quality of armor, for example, on, again, the power of the crossbow, whatever. Ambroise, that describes the same battle versus states that similarly that the Frankish infantry were, quote, armed quite well according to the custom of foot soldiers, so that this was somehow habitual, with head protected by an iron cover, so with a coif, some sort of a helmet, a hauberk, and a linen tunic padded many times and difficult to penetrate, ingeniously worked with a needle, and consequently called in the vernacular a pourpoint. So I meant porcupine before, not pourpoint, just I had read this under my eyes. It was Freudian lapses. But even in here, you understand that those guys were moving around with most of this padded clothing that was not completely costless, but it was dramatically effective because most of the blows and most of the hits, etc., would not penetrate. Right, this has been at least one of the few things that makes sense in replicas, in testing, etc. You know, that evidently, from a physical point of view, padded armor can absorb an awful lot of trauma, of hits. Consider all these arrows fall also with with spent force, at bad angle for penetration, whatever. So if you're consistently armored, especially you see the head protected with metal and still the corselets being worn like the padded armor worn underneath, but sometimes even above, right? This was sometimes done. At least they had. There are pictures here that I uploaded, in fact, just to show this, that were troops often equipped with merely padded armor as such, and with different layers. Consider that also some troops had so many layers. I mean, the 10th, 11th century Byzantine cataphracts had basically 3 layers, like 2 of mail, 1 of scale. It was, of course, they were insanely heavy, and that's the reason why basically they were created. They had to be heavier than anyone else, but they cost so much that at a point they had to basically stop with them in Komnenian times. In any case, this especially this double appreciation of the protection, right, the armor of the Crusade infantry, the Battle of Arsuf, is indicative, generally speaking, yes, what basically by the end of the 12th century also infantry had developed like, with a very high degree of protection. Infantries at this point have proven to be able to even face cavalry in open field on a regular basis, at least in some areas of Europe. Naturally, again, not being decisive, but so victory always being collected by the cavalry. This is the case also in the Near East. I think there are just a few examples of, I will treat them in Crusade warfare, where technically everybody dismounted or they used carts or something like to defend themselves from the Islamic attacks, and some successfully. So that surely had an influence. That surely had a meaning, had a function. But generally speaking, at this point, by the beginning of the 13th century, we really have a much more highly functional system where also properly troop types are specialized to be effectively interacting, cooperating with one another. And infantry is still fundamentally auxiliary to cavalry, but it's properly heavy, right? And it's well defended just at this point from enemy darts, etc. Right? And consider in this that this kind of equipment, as we will see now, was not again developed because of the Crusades. It was already the one they had in Europe. I mean, in Europe you find heavy crossbow fire everywhere at this point. Let's remember that even in Europe, crossbows were mostly kind of anti-cavalry weapon. At least they killed horses like crazy, and horses were mostly unarmored. So it's obvious that by going to fight in the Crusades, an enraged knight or his retinue or mercenaries, whatever, were already pretty well defended, pretty well armored to counter pretty heavy fire, and so they were already capable to cope with this especially with the horse archers fielded by the Muslim foes. Now, when we look at the kilted corselets we just mentioned, especially, it turns out, however, that these were somehow, this is a bit of another cliche, but this one I do believe in, the fact that, albeit known in Europe for several centuries, we know that probably they were all around also during the ancient era. Even, I don't know, at the time of Roman legionaries, you would have been impressed by the degree of padded armor that was around, all colored, all multiform. You never quite see it so much, and except maybe if you look at some ospreys from D'Amato, like, that has this bias for it. You see the degree of heterogeneity and complexity and colorfulness and all this stuff. But seemingly in the West, they came into widespread use only during the Crusades, right? Again, this is a very debated topic, right? Again, the cliche that actually I disagree with is, in this part, is the fact that it would happen because the Crusaders would get in contact with the Muslims, right? So that the Muslims, since they made use of that, particularly, apparently, would somehow influence the Crusaders, right? As a sort of, kilted armor being a sort of standard form of body defense. We will talk about this in some video about Muslim forces, etc. This should, however, also be redimensioned a little bit. Why? So, first of all, again, the technology was there, the type of armor was known. We hardly know how widespread it really was back in the day. Yes, we do have a pretty large amount of iconography from the previous centuries, even before the Crusades, but we don't fully understand, given the art, given the relative paucity of that before a certain time, how widespread this kind of kilted armor really was. It's like when, say, during the 13th century, coat of mail for horses starts becoming like a full thing, right? For an ultra elite, very small numerically speaking. but we don't understand sometimes from the actual materials in which they're depicted whether we're talking about, in fact, actually just like a comparison, right? Padded armor, or maybe leather even by a degree. We don't understand it clearly because it's not written what material those art, like reliefs, etc., are supposed to be represented. So we're a bit in the dark, and there's a debate also regarding antiquity, like why seemingly there was less kilted stuff around. It's something I'm not going to discuss today, but I will bring you with some evidence when we'll at least look at ancient armor, padded armor, things like that. In any case, what seems more what seems at least mitigating to me is, first of all, that Muslims have, as we've seen, tendentially lighter troops than the Westerners, right? So it may be possible that, of course, like this, the skilled armor was surely more used. I don't doubt it was more used in the East than in Europe. However, the fact that you're lighter also implies that you have less metal armor that usually is worn over this kind of armor. So it may just iconographically not necessarily make sense. It's also a different type of warfare. Meaningfully enough, it's also a matter of climate. Fighting in the Syrian desert in July is not exactly a normal experience. Let's put it in this way: if you wear metal armor, right? That's not just the only reason why they used surcoats and things like that, but literally, this padded armor is mostly, if it's made, as we'll see now, of cotton or some other isolating material, even wool. Berbers in the desert wear wool because it's isolating, and even under the heating sun, the temperature outside is lower than the one of inside underneath the clothes, and you put your body right under the wool, right? So it's equally for the night. There is a lot of thermic excursion. It's really cold, and you with wool you're warm. So the need not to overheat, possibly even the necessity of using, as it seems to be the case even in this in the pictures that I present you here from the very famous manuscript, is the presence of padded armor worn over mail, right? This is pretty clear. Metal armor could be worn underneath the padded clothing, and if anything, we mostly see that if, say, the guy is wearing some cuisse, for example, and this was mostly a typical 13th century. We would have the stuff worn even over the surcoat sometimes, or some kind of vest, more of kind of average clothes there later. I mean, in any case, this shows also how really effective this armor could be, right? To protect even a much heavier armor, right? And thus, depending on the technicalities that largely we can't fully understand, at least you can, in the sense, try to wear replicas, stressing yourself under the sun or under the weather in general, and coming out with an idea. But mostly we see various combinations from multiple contexts, right? And generally speaking, again, by the 13th century, we have just even a heavier infantry, a very heavily equipped infantry around that is still the elite of it. We don't see much of the rest. That's another problem. But with this important heavy amount of defenses. As you know, this type of padded armor was known in the Frankish corrupted term al-Qutun, which derives from the Arab al-Qutun, meaning literally cotton, right? So we will talk. I don't remember if I have discussed this already in some video, but we'll surely come back on this type of armor. The gambizon was an alternative term that first appeared around the 60s of the 12th century, and it could derive from the fact that this padded clothing differed from the al-Qutun in having sleeves, because gambizon could come from jambe, from legs, from arms, and this may be the kind of the case. We see it in fact also later in time, so it would just naturally be the extension of a sort of kind of more primitive initial corselet or type of it could go down even the waist and beyond, but that wouldn't be so articulated, right? Instead we see especially the gambizon even as properly some form of like boxers of some sort of, and being of a different piece also from the various strata, right? You could put especially above it. The surface of this armor could be leather, linen, or wool, right, with wool inside of it, right? Cotton, or sometimes even old rags, and quilted either vertically or diagonally. So even the composition differed in practice, and from the outer side we also don't always know how it was underneath, right? All the debate about leather armor, how spread it was, and all this stuff. Based on the illustration of the Acre manuscript dating to around, say, the 80s of the 13th century, we can observe the aforementioned overimposition of corselets worn over the other, normally again, or possibly, at least as far as the terminology precision is concerned, an al-Qutun worn over a gambizon, right? The similar sources from the late 13th century show the this armor substituting properly the male corselet and surcoat, but shoes could be worn in addition, so that could also be a thing. As we said before, and we could recognize, because padded armor for legs is somehow rarer, so it's more likely to be wearing something else, also not to properly hamper movement, at least mobility of in across space, rather than what you could manage in let's say just to move around with this kind of more padded body. But again, consider the role of infantry, generally speaking, as subordinate to cavalry, and so mostly actually taking parts, of course, in melee, but for most of the time being mostly stationary, mostly having to also shield the missile troops, thus forming this kind of walls that eventually could advance and kill and whatever, but with mostly a smashing power of cavalry involved rather in the process, rather than the one of infantry. But again, they were used also in pretty aggressive roles. Always remember that even in siege warfare, however, it was the knights that really stormed the fortifications on a regular basis. So these guys would just follow always the heavies in a way or another, so would be technically less exposed, less involved in the most shock dimension, at least in open field. In defense, they during siege warfare, etc., would be more involved definitely in the first line, but also at that point you having the advantage of the fortifications themselves. Any speculation regarding, for example, the whether the crossbowmen or archers would wear shields or not, because the iconography suggests they wouldn't, mostly, unlike spearmen, which has a logic indeed. I mean, the idea, as we've seen, is that light infantry doesn't properly engage, right? They're not meant to. But is a bit just a bit too wargame-istic. Of course, there could be archers or crossbowmen that had a shield, right? The idea is that, especially later with pavises, we get the stereotypical idea that you could have a shield slung over the back, right? We see so that you could turn to reload and by crouching and having your back covered in open field. This may have surely been a thing already in this time, right? There is no doubt about that. As far as also, and we see this, for example, in the Near East, in lots of peoples, that horse archers often have a sort of buckler tied to their vambrace, their left one, like that they use without handling. Sometimes they did. But mostly as a sort of additional shield, especially in a context in which those horse archers would be, as we've seen, mostly unarmored, and thus being slightly more necessitating some extra defenses they could, but mostly also being able to use that in some kind of close combat. This is possible also for Western archers, right? Again, remember there were Turcopoles among them, that these would also dismount, so there wouldn't be anything strange about that. Interestingly enough, we do see from the illuminated manuscript of Acre dating to 1290-1291 circular shields used by Crusade infantry, right? There is even here inserted at some point one manuscript dating to 1287 depicting an oval shield as well. Now, there is no real problem with that. The point is, what does it mean exactly? Well, especially at this point, we're pretty late in time, so as you know, plate armor has already come around, and the shields would tendentially be always smaller, right? Triangular in shape for the knights, and this seemed mostly an obvious solution, given that armor was becoming ever heavier, covering the legs that before the kite-shaped shield could cover, like the triangular point towards the drop with the vertex towards the feet and so on. At this point, even though infantries have increased in lethality, let's say, it's armor that has taken over, because that's better than the shield after all. So the fact that there is a noble, and apparently also kind of not necessarily flat, right, but not even particularly enveloping shield there, may mean something interesting in terms of some sort of more kind of shield wall, right? Primarily kind of an anti-missile function rather than something suited more specialistically for hand-to-hand combat, unless we don't think it's some sort of shield wall kind of disposition. That is just how you normally use shields in more compact formations that do not have that individualistic mindset for which just the knight goes out, and for which the kite-shaped shield was also concave originally. There were also lighter types of infantry by some degree that would necessitate smaller shields or something less encumbrant. Consider that there were different times really for different purposes, so we can't properly speak of like a necessary functionality other than literally being either a lighter shield than the usual, and or something that was developed for reasons that do not have quite to do with, again, what was happening in the Near East, militarily wise. This is relevant enough. Speaking of average clothes that these troops could wear at a point, especially when they weren't in military gear, we would see, first of all, the material being cotton, wool, linen, silk. Silk, as you know, is also sometimes pretty used in a military context is still used in body armor nowadays because it's extremely resistant. It was extremely costly. Colors were bright. We see it clearly red, green, yellow, mainly, but also black. Right. Also, we've seen in the videos about the Templars and the Hospitallers. Of course, there was a sort of uniform at that point. There was a lot of gold in embroidered, as far as the rich embroiderment of the richest people, right? Were concerned with colored threads and so on. As far as the appearance, the Franks were clean-shaven generally by the mid-12th century. Right, they were a bit rougher then. The feudal ideal came to be a bit more Alexandrian in some way, a bit more Apollonian, so they shaved. And one contemporary pilgrim at the time noted that of all the peoples of Outre-mer, these Franks were the only ones who shaved their beard, right? Which was an important way also to distinguish themselves from the rest, right? That even if it was a matter of pride, it was a matter of distinction. The Franks were generally speaking more connected with the rulers of the Outre-mer, at least in the Crusade-dominated areas, right? So this is just for knowing how they would generally speaking look like. So we can expect infantry being fundamentally about having this general outlook, right? Consider again there was plenty of different people coming from different places, right? At some point, you have Westerners that even start specializing in kind of local, for example, in Turkopol tactics, right? Even people coming from Greece, for example, from Sicily, mostly. Yes, we're talking about the 13th century, so we would see them in the place. These areas were undergoing crisis at the time, and they would put out lots of soldiers that, given the general price that the general cost, the evaluation that the name of the Turkopol had as a sort of tactical specialty would in fact call themselves Turkopols, even though they were Westerners. There were Byzantines, there were even Franks themselves. Again, this had begun properly since the beginning, as far as we understand. There were surely some, especially from the retinues of the knights, troops that were starting to fight as horse archers on a more regular basis in the Near East than in Western Europe, for obvious reasons, without ever forgetting, however, that in Western Europe it was full of horse archers and crossbowmen. Okay, they weren't really so widespread, but they always existed, and they actually were quite important. Technically, mounted crossbowmen, I also made a video about them for the 13th century, were often were a bit like the crossbows on foot, as we've seen, an elite and a prized one, a costly one that princes and other updated rulers would want to have in some number. In the Near East, we see mostly the Turkopols, right? So mostly horse archers that who are perhaps better suited to the type of local warfare than crossbowmen that had, less mobile targets in the West than in the East, and so were also a bit less than just one shot at a time, or with a slower great, but again, these mounted crossbowmen were operating in the east as well against the horse archers, of course. So this is more or less the picture I wanted to draw now, and the general, again, idea we get is the one of some well-equipped infantry, so few but good, right? And probably, however, supported by more elements that also we don't quite see as much. And I think that especially the local native element was less represented in the sources than we're often told, because we have this evidence here and there that, again, there were natives, locals, say Armenian allies, for example, etc. That, however, of course, the stories concentrate less on, because they were less relevant, they were not so important to literally to be named as much as, say, the knights, the leaders, and we're lucky if we get, especially for the 11th, 12th century, any broader notion. But we do have this thing, again, there is a substantially advanced historiography, at least as far as combat is concerned, as we've seen in the battle videos of the Crusades, that there is enough to feel that the amount of this troops, right, the tactical specialties, how the battles unfolded, etc. So I would say there is really much to look at, which we will hopefully continue doing. However, for now I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.